welcome the Lord's chosen. In a world full of actors, the real ones are the most dangerous. That's not just a quote, it's a warning. Because the moment you stopped dimming your light, stopped shrinking to be digestible, and stopped apologizing for being real, something shifted. Not in you, you've always known who you are, but in them. The ones who built entire identities on performance, on manipulation, on being whatever the crowd wanted. You didn't just walk in different. You exposed the whole illusion they were trying to keep alive. See, here's the truth most people will never admit. Authenticity doesn't make people uncomfortable because it's weird. It makes them uncomfortable because it's honest. It reveals how many masks they've glued to their faces just to feel accepted. And when you showed up as yourself, raw, unfiltered, unapologetically real, it disrupted the entire ecosystem they thrived in. They couldn't predict you, control you, or guilt trip you, and that made them nervous. You weren't following their script. And that's when they realized they were dealing with something far more powerful than rebellion. They were dealing with someone who couldn't be programmed. Psychology even backs it up. Studies show most people would rather be accepted than authentic. They'll betray themselves, abandon their convictions, and shapeshift into whatever pleases the room just to avoid rejection. But you chose truth over comfort. You chose freedom over fitting in. You were the glitch in their matrix, the unscripted truth in a room full of rehearsed performances. And let's be real, you didn't even have to say much. Just being yourself had them fidgeting like they heard the cops knock on a door they weren't supposed to be at. They called you difficult, arrogant, intimidating. But what they really meant was, you can't be controlled by our usual tricks. You weren't addicted to applause. You didn't sell out for social points. You held the one thing they feared the most, and you held it without flinching. Your authenticity wasn't just different, it was dangerous, and now they're scrambling, trying to rewrite the rules of a game you already ended. Welcome to the part of the story where the chosen one stops trying to fit in and starts flipping the entire power structure just by telling the truth. Let's get into it. Number one, your authenticity destroyed their manufactured illusions. They built their entire world on performance. Every smile was rehearsed, every compliment calculated, every interaction filtered through layers of control and manipulation. Their image was their currency, and everyone around them had agreed, whether silently or openly, to play along. But you walked in with nothing but your truth. No performance, no mask, just raw, honest presence. And that's when the cracks started to show. You didn't expose them by yelling, accusing, or pointing fingers. You exposed them by simply being exactly who you are, without asking for permission. That alone made their entire illusion start to collapse. They weren't prepared for someone who didn't play the image game. They didn't know how to respond to a person who didn't need validation to feel whole. And that's what made you dangerous. Your authenticity didn't just challenge them, it revealed them. It revealed how fake their relationships were, how shallow their confidence was, how fragile their sense of self actually is. Because they had spent years carefully building a reputation, and here you come, breathing, walking, and existing in complete alignment, and it tore through their performance like a gust of wind through a paper wall. The crazy part is you didn't try to expose anyone, you didn't have to. The truth doesn't need a spotlight, it creates its own. And that's what happened when you stayed grounded in who you are. You made people around you question why they'd been pretending for so long. You made people squirm without even raising your voice. That kind of energy is rare. It's not loud, but it's loud enough to shake foundations, because when everything around you is built on lies, the presence of truth feels like a threat. They called you intimidating, difficult, too much, but that was just projection. The real issue was that your authenticity made it impossible for them to keep living in their performance. You didn't destroy them. You exposed what they were hiding behind, and that's why they feared you. Number two, you were a mirror. They couldn't manipulate. They were used to people adjusting, bending, and shrinking to fit into the roles they handed out. That's how they kept control, by shaping others into reflections of what they wanted to see. It was never about truth, it was about dominance. They liked mirrors that flattered their ego, not ones that told the truth. But when you came into the picture, they hit a wall. You weren't interested in performing. You weren't trying to gain points, approval, or acceptance. You were just being you without any filter. And that's what flipped the whole power dynamic on its head. You didn't mold yourself to match their insecurities. You didn't fake humility to make them feel bigger. You didn't exaggerate your pain to be pitied or downplay your strength to be liked. You showed up as a reflection they couldn't distort. And that's what made them uncomfortable, because while they could twist others into watered-down versions of themselves, they couldn't twist you. You didn't flinch under pressure. You didn't give them fake emotions just to keep the peace. Your clarity became a threat, not because you were aggressive, but because you were unshakably real. They started picking at you, questioning your tone, labeling you with words like arrogant or insensitive, but those were just distractions. What they were really saying was, "You're not mirroring what I need to see to feel superior." They were used to people who mirrored their delusions, their control, their brokenness. But when you refused to reflect that back and instead stood as a mirror of truth, they saw parts of themselves they couldn't handle. You exposed their double standards just by existing. You showed how insecure they really were, how hungry they were for control, and how desperate they were to keep the illusion going. And because they couldn't change you, they tried to discredit you. But none of it stuck, because your authenticity wasn't built on their approval in the first place. You weren't reflecting their image. You were holding up a mirror to their soul, and that scared them more than anything else ever could. Number 3, you made peace with aloneness, so they couldn't control you. They thought isolating you would break you, that pulling back their support, their conversations, their fake love would make you desperate enough to come crawling back and beg for acceptance. That's how they controlled everyone else, through the fear of being alone. But when they tried it on you, it didn't work. You didn't fold. You didn't chase. You didn't self-destruct. Instead, you got stronger. That's when they realized they had no real power over you, because what they didn't understand is that you had already faced your loneliness head-on. You had already walked through the silence most people are terrified of, and you found peace there. While they used people as distractions, noise, and validation, you used your solitude to listen deeply to yourself, to God, to your inner knowing. And when the noise faded, your clarity came alive. That's what they weren't prepared for. They thought being alone would leave you empty, but it made you full. You became rooted. You stopped outsourcing your worth to others. You stopped needing to be chosen because you chose yourself. They couldn't manipulate you with guilt or silence or fake loyalty. You had already detached from needing their approval. You found out who you really were in that quiet space they tried to use as punishment. And now that you're grounded in that, they have nothing to use against you. No emotional bait, no social pressure, no psychological tricks. They lost the ability to pull your strings. The truth is, most people live in fear of being alone because they're afraid of what they'll find when everything and everyone is stripped away. But you met yourself in that empty space and didn't run. You owned it. And that's why you became untouchable. They tried to exile you, but all they did was push you into the place where your power was waiting. Now they're the ones looking for connection, for validation, for control, and you're walking in peace they can't even fake. You made peace with aloneness, and in doing so you became someone they could never control again. Number 4, you didn't chase inclusion, you exposed the cost of it. They thought you'd fold the moment they pulled back the invitation, that you'd do what most people do. Water yourself down, adjust your tone, reshape your truth, just to be let back in. That's how they train people, reward the obedient, isolate the authentic. But you didn't chase inclusion. You didn't plead to sit at their table. You stood up and asked why the table was built on lies in the first place. And that's when everything shifted. Your refusal to conform didn't just confuse them, it exposed them. You made people uncomfortable by refusing to play the role they expected. They weren't used to someone who could walk away from approval like it was nothing, because for them, belonging meant survival. They had paid a high price to be accepted. They had silenced themselves, betrayed themselves, pretended constantly just to stay in the circle. You walked in and made it clear. You'd rather stand alone in truth than sit comfortably in a lie. That kind of clarity threatens people who've built their entire identity on fitting in. The moment you chose to keep your integrity instead of buying entry with your soul, you stopped being someone they could tolerate. You became a mirror of everything they gave up just to be liked. You didn't scream, you didn't beg, you just didn't sell out. And that quiet defiance hit louder than any protest. It showed how far they were willing to go for inclusion and how far you weren't. They never expected that. They assumed everyone wanted a seat at their table, but you wanted something deeper, something real. And when you didn't flinch at rejection, when you didn't crumble without their approval, It forced them to ask themselves if they even belonged in the first place, because your presence reminded them of the cost they paid to belong, and it made them wonder if it was ever worth it. You didn't just decline inclusion, you exposed the true price of it, and you made everyone around you rethink what they were really chasing. Number 5, you were unapologetically awake in a system built on sleepwalking. You were never the problem. They just weren't used to someone seeing straight through the fog they've been living in their whole lives, while others nodded along, played the game, and stayed silent to keep the peace. You saw the cracks in the foundation and refused to pretend they weren't there. Most people go along with the script because it's easier. It keeps them fed, praised, accepted. But you questioned everything. You didn't just notice the lies, you named them. You didn't whisper truth in safe corners, you said it out loud in rooms where everyone else had agreed to stay asleep. That made you dangerous, not because you were loud or aggressive, but because you were awake. In a system built on people following blindly, someone with eyes wide open is a threat. Your awareness disrupted their comfort, it challenged their routines, it exposed how much of their identity was based on doing what they were told. They weren't ready to face that. So instead of asking what you saw that they didn't, they tried to turn you into the villain. They called you rebellious, difficult, too intense. But the truth is, they needed you to be small so they could stay numb. You didn't fall for the distractions they used to keep people docile. You didn't chase their approval or get addicted to their rewards. You moved through life with a kind of clarity that made it impossible to manipulate you and that terrified them. Because someone who sees the system for what it is can't be bribed, guilted, or gaslit into compliance. You tore up the script and lived your truth out loud, and in doing that, you reminded others that they'd been sleepwalking through their own lives. You didn't just shine a light, you were the light. And in a world trained to flinch at brightness, that kind of presence will always make people squint. You weren't supposed to wake up, you weren't supposed to see, but you did. And once you did, you became uncontrollable. Not because you wanted power, but because you could no longer be lied to. And that's the kind of freedom this system fears most. Number 6, your energy was a threat because it was clean. They didn't know what to do with someone who wasn't playing the same dirty game they were. Your energy wasn't chaotic, manipulative, or driven by ego. It was clean. And that terrified them. They couldn't get a read on you, couldn't bait you, couldn't corner you emotionally. You didn't come in trying to outshine anyone, compete for power, or earn cheap validation. You just existed in your truth, and that alone made the air around you feel different. Threatening. Exposing. People like them are used to operating in spaces where everyone has something to hide. Secrets are currency, guilt is leverage, shame is the leash. That's how they control people, through unspoken rules and emotional blackmail. But you didn't have anything they could hold over your head. You weren't pretending to be someone you're not. You didn't need approval to feel secure. You weren't wearing a mask they could rip off. That level of emotional transparency made you immune to their favorite tricks. They searched for your angle and found nothing. That scared them. Because in their world, nobody's clean. Everyone's manipulating something or someone. But your motives weren't rooted in fear, control, or insecurity. You weren't plotting. You were just being. And that kind of presence breaks the unwritten agreement in toxic environments. We all pretend, we all hide, and no one speaks the real truth. You violated that contract without even trying. That's why they turned on you. Not because you did something wrong, but because you made it clear how much they were doing wrong just to keep their image intact. You became the one person in the room who couldn't be blackmailed, couldn't be guilted, couldn't be lured into silent compromise. And that made you powerful in a way they couldn't replicate. You didn't play the power game, you broke it, just by being someone whose energy couldn't be polluted or twisted. That's why they panicked. Because once someone shows it's possible to live without all the manipulation, control, and hidden motives, the whole structure starts to fall apart. And you were that someone. Number 7, they wanted you predictable. You showed up as divine chaos. They wanted a script. They wanted to box you in, label you, control how you'd respond so they could stay one step ahead. But you didn't move according to their expectations. You moved according to truth, real truth. And that made you unpredictable in the most divine way. They were ready for someone who would either bow down or blow up. That's the only language they understand, submission or resistance, but you showed up with something completely different. You didn't come to fight their system, you came to transcend it. You weren't playing chess with them, you were playing an entirely different game, one they don't even have the rule book for. They called it chaos, but it was alignment. Your actions didn't follow logic that made sense to their control-driven minds. You said yes when they expected you to fold. You walked away when they thought they had you hooked. You forgave when they wanted a fight. You let things burn that others would have killed to hold on to. You weren't moving from ego or fear. You were being led by spirit, and spirit doesn't make sense to people addicted to strategy and manipulation. They couldn't anticipate your moves because you weren't trying to win in their world. You weren't calculating your worth by status, applause, or dominance. You were tapped into a higher flow, one that can't be coerced, seduced, or predicted. That's what made you divine chaos. Not recklessness, but divine disruption. You didn't burn bridges out of spite. You let them fall when they couldn't hold the weight of your truth anymore. They called you unstable because you wouldn't stay in the box. They called you difficult because you couldn't be tamed. But deep down, they knew what it really was, freedom. And freedom terrifies those who've never felt it. You moved without asking permission, without needing approval, without waiting to be understood. That kind of sovereignty threatens everything built on control. You weren't wild, you were free. And in a world that survives on keeping souls in cages, that kind of energy will always be seen as dangerous. Number 8, you were unbought, therefore unowned. They tried everything: flattery, guilt, fake opportunities, backhanded compliments disguised as praise. Anything to get you to play the game, but you didn't. You didn't jump when they dangled rewards. You didn't cave when they withheld them either. That's when they realized they had a problem. Because in a world where nearly everyone has a price, your refusal to be bought made you unpredictable, uncontrollable, and worst of all, for them, incorruptible. You weren't seduced by recognition. You weren't chasing status or fake alliances. You didn't sell pieces of yourself for approval or access. You stood in your own value, and that made them nervous. Because control only works on people who are still bargaining with their worth. But you weren't negotiating. You had already made peace with losing things others would kill to keep: popularity, protection, comfort. You knew that if something required you to shrink, lie, or sell your soul, it wasn't worth having. And that's what made you dangerous. They couldn't dangle leverage over your head because you weren't hiding anything. You weren't in debt to their validation. Your loyalty wasn't for sale. It was sacred. And that confused people who only know how to function in environments where everything is transactional. Your presence alone broke the unspoken rule that says, play along or be punished. You didn't play, and they couldn't punish you because you had already detached from the illusion that they had anything you needed. They wanted ownership of your narrative, your gifts, your voice, but you were rooted in something they didn't give you, so they couldn't take it away. You walked with the kind of freedom that makes people angry when they've spent their whole lives chasing crumbs. You were proof that it's possible to keep your soul intact and still walk in power, that you can say no and still stand tall, that you can choose truth over comfort and still win. You weren't just unbought, you were untouchable, and in a world that runs on control, that made you a serious problem. Number 9, you didn't abandon yourself to belong. That's what frightened them. You walked into rooms with your whole self, not just the parts you thought would be accepted. You didn't trim your edges to make others comfortable. You didn't lock your intensity in a box to appear more agreeable. You didn't hide your wounds, your weirdness, or your fire. You brought it all with you, boldly, unapologetically, without shame. And that kind of wholeness disturbed people, because most of them have spent their entire lives editing themselves just to belong. You didn't flatter them with the usual performance. You didn't try to be palatable. You didn't speak in watered-down truths or filter your light. You showed up raw, integrated, and alive. And the truth is, they couldn't handle it. Not because you were wrong, but because you reminded them of the parts of themselves they had long buried just to be accepted. You were living proof that it was possible to belong to yourself first, and that shook the entire foundation they built their identity on. They wanted you to be insecure enough to ask for a seat at the table, but you were the table. They wanted you to mold yourself into something safe, soft, and silent, but you were none of those things. You didn't split yourself just to be liked. You didn't betray your truth just to be seen. And that's what made you powerful. Because people who don't abandon themselves can't be used as puppets. Your presence made people uncomfortable because it mirrored their own compromises. Every piece of you they mocked or misunderstood was a part of themselves they sacrificed a long time ago. And seeing you fully intact, fully you, forced them to confront what they lost just to be accepted. It wasn't your boldness that offended them, it was your freedom, because once someone sees it's possible to belong to themselves without permission, the lie they've been living becomes unbearable. You didn't need their approval, and that's what made you unforgettable, and for some, unbearable. Number 10. Your presence made cowards rethink their entire lives. You didn't come in swinging, trying to prove a point. You didn't wave your truth around like a weapon. You simply were, authentically, unshakably, unapologetically, and that was enough. Enough to make the ones who've built their lives on pretense start to sweat. Because your presence alone held a kind of power that didn't need explanation. You walked into rooms and made people feel everything they'd spent years avoiding. It wasn't what you said, it was how you existed. Grounded, clear, not performing, not pretending. And that kind of realness, it unsettles those who have made comfort out of lies. You didn't try to fix them or shame them or force them to grow, but being around you made them realize just how much of their life was borrowed. Borrowed beliefs, borrowed roles, borrowed confidence. You didn't chase validation, and that exposed how much they did. You didn't flinch in your truth, and that showed them how often they compromised theirs. You reminded them of everything they ran from, every time they said yes when they meant no, every moment they stayed quiet to keep the peace. Every time they looked in the mirror and didn't recognize who they'd become. You didn't judge them, but your freedom did, because when someone walks in full alignment, it reveals the cost of living out of alignment, and for those still trapped in fear, that revelation is jarring. That's why some distanced themselves from you. Not because you were wrong, but because being around you was a mirror they weren't ready to look into. Your presence made them rethink their choices, their masks, their definitions of strength. You didn't try to be anyone's example, but you became one. And that made the cowards uncomfortable, because deep down, they knew your life wasn't louder than theirs, it was just honest. And sometimes honesty doesn't shout, it just stands still. And in that stillness, people see everything they've avoided. You were a wake-up call they never asked for, but couldn't unhear. Number 11, you thrived without permission. That was the real offense. They were used to people asking for approval, begging to be seen, waiting in line to be accepted. That's how the system keeps order. Make everyone believe they need a stamp before they can move, speak, shine, or lead. But you didn't play that game. You didn't wait for someone to invite you into your purpose. You didn't audition for your own life. You walked like you already belonged. You acted like you were enough. And that's what made people lose it. You didn't knock on doors. You built your own. You didn't sit around hoping someone would finally notice your value. You embodied it loudly and without apology. And that kind of self-declared worth is threatening to people who believe someone else has to crown them before they matter. You bypassed the gatekeepers entirely and made your own lane. That wasn't arrogance. It was clarity. You weren't asking for power. You already knew you had it. They hated it because you exposed the illusion. You showed that waiting to be chosen is a trap, that most people aren't lacking talent or vision. They're just waiting for permission that was never going to come. And you proved you didn't need anyone's green light to move forward. That rattled them, because suddenly their excuses looked weak next to your courage. You thrived without their approval, their blueprint, their applause, and that meant they could have done the same, but they didn't. They waited, they compromised, they dimmed. So when you came along and skipped the whole cycle, they didn't see inspiration, they saw a mirror. And in that mirror was the reflection of everything they could have been if fear hadn't kept them small. You weren't defiant, just to be rebellious. You simply knew you didn't need their yes to validate your path. That made you dangerous. Because once one person bulldozes the gate, everyone else starts questioning why they're still standing in line. You didn't thrive because they let you. You thrived because you stopped needing them to. That was the real offense. Number 12, you never gave them a version of you they could control. They kept poking at you, hoping you'd fold into something smaller, softer, more manageable, not because they hated you, but because they couldn't handle the version of you that refused to play by their rules. They tried to tame you with guilt. Be more humble. They tried to bind you with expectations. You're too much. But all of it was code for one thing. Make yourself easier to control. You didn't. You refused to hand over a filtered, diluted version of yourself just to make them feel secure in their limitations. You weren't rude, you were real. And for people who only know how to relate through power plays and performance, real is terrifying. They wanted access to you, but only if it came with reins attached. You denied them that. You didn't give them the comfort of knowing what you'd do next. You didn't let them label you into something predictable. You stayed unboxed, unbought, and untamed. That's what made you powerful. Not that you were loud or confrontational, but that you were sovereign. Your boundaries weren't up for debate. Your energy wasn't up for exploitation. You didn't need to be liked to be grounded. You didn't contort your truth to be accepted. You didn't silence your fire to protect their egos. You didn't shrink. You expanded. And your expansion pushed up against their inner limits, forcing them to feel everything they'd buried. The dreams they abandoned, the voices they silenced, the truth they never had the guts to speak. You weren't just showing up, you were calling them out without saying a word, and they hated that. Because control only works when people are still scared of not being accepted. But you weren't scared. You had already chosen yourself. And there is nothing more threatening to insecure people than someone who doesn't need their approval to be whole. You didn't play small to fit their script. You walked off their stage entirely. And when you did, the whole illusion fell apart. They couldn't control you because you were never performing for them to begin with. Number 13, your wounds were visible, but so was your power. They expected your pain to disqualify you. They assumed your scars would make you easy to dismiss. But instead of hiding them, you wore them in full view. You didn't mask your story to make others comfortable. You didn't pretend to have it all together just to fit their image of strength. You allowed your broken places to breathe, and in doing so, you shattered the illusion that vulnerability is weakness. They couldn't understand it. Because they were used to people covering up their wounds, not walking boldly with them. They were used to suffering in silence, not speaking from it with authority. You didn't pretend your life was perfect. You didn't wait to be fully healed to show up. You let your truth exist out loud, and that in itself was a revolution. Because in a world obsessed with image and denial, you chose honesty. And that made people nervous. Your pain wasn't the problem, your power was. The fact that you could carry both at once, that you could still show up, still speak truth, still radiate strength without hiding your bruises, that confused people. You didn't just survive what was meant to destroy you. You thrived through it and made no effort to erase the process. You didn't heal quietly in the dark. You healed in plain sight. And that shook people to their core. Because deep down they were still hiding their own stories, still trying to act untouched by life, still hoping no one would see their cracks. And there you were, standing tall, scarred but solid, not ashamed, not silent, fully alive. Your existence made them ask hard questions. What have I been hiding? What if I let myself be seen? What if strength isn't pretending but being real? You didn't need to lecture anyone. Your life was the example. Your courage wasn't in never being hurt. It was in refusing to stay hidden because of it. You were proof that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's power in its rawest, most unstoppable form, and that terrified those who built their entire identities around hiding. Number 14, they couldn't keep up with a soul that doesn't conform. They spent so much time shaping themselves to fit in, adjusting their masks to match whatever the crowd wanted, always chasing approval like a dog chasing its tail. Their whole existence became a performance, changing their story, their opinions, even their values to avoid conflict, to stay safe, to be liked. But you weren't playing that game. You weren't addicted to being understood or accepted. You were addicted to being real. Your compass pointed inward, not outward. Every day you peeled back another layer of pretense. You didn't hide behind labels or wear someone else's identity just to fit a mold. You exposed your complexities, your contradictions, your truths, even when it made people uncomfortable or confused. Because for you, the goal wasn't to blend in, it was to evolve. And evolution requires honesty, vulnerability, and a refusal to stay stuck in old versions of yourself. They thought they could keep up by copying trends, by reinventing themselves superficially. But you were digging deeper, growing roots instead of just changing leaves. Their reinventions were costumes, yours was transformation. They were rehearsing lines for a play that never felt authentic, while you were writing an unscripted story that kept unfolding in real time. That's why they lost. Not because you outsmarted them or fought harder, but because you refused to conform to their predictable cycle of survival. You became fluid while they stayed rigid. You moved with purpose while they stumbled through their act. You lived with integrity while they existed on the surface. In a world that rewards fitting in, your refusal to conform was a rebellion. And the truth is, no matter how fast they tried to change faces, they could never catch up to a soul that keeps evolving honestly and fearlessly. You didn't just survive their game, you rewrote the rules by simply being unapologetically yourself. In the end, the real power you hold isn't found in tactics, manipulation, or approval. It's rooted deep in the unshakable truth of who you are. You flipped their game not by playing their rules, but by refusing to play at all. Your authenticity wasn't just a light in the dark, it was a blaze that exposed every shadow they hid behind. While they chased illusions, you lived realities. While they copied masks, you unveiled your face. And that relentless courage to simply be fully, fiercely, unapologetically shattered the foundation of their control. You became the living proof that no system, no expectation, no fear can contain a soul anchored in truth. What they feared most wasn't your success, your strength, or your voice. It was your refusal to be anything less than real. And that refusal is your greatest victory. So keep standing in that power. Keep thriving without permission. Keep being the beautifully untamed force that rewrites what it means to live authentically. Because at the end of the day, the only game worth playing is the one where you own your truth. And in that game, you don't just win, you become unstoppable. If this message hit your soul, don't keep it to yourself. Go ahead and like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below to let me know which part spoke to you the most. Your voice matters here. And if you're walking this path of truth, power, and purpose with no apology, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications, because this isn't just content, it's a movement. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Stay real, stay rooted, and never dim your light.